The United States government once printed a $10,000 bill, not a commemorative, not a fantasy piece, a genuine spendable, walk into a store and buy things Federal Reserve note, engraved and issued by the Treasury of the United States, bearing the portrait of a man most Americans cannot name, a man who was never president. At the time of its final printing, a single one of these bills held the purchasing power of a comfortable house. A working man, earning the average wage of the era, could have labored 4 or 5 years and never held, in total, what one of these notes carried in a pocket, and it was not alone. Alongside it, America printed $500 bills wearing William McKinley, $1,000 bills wearing Grover Cleveland, $5,000 bills wearing James Madison, and above them all, a note almost nobody has ever seen. A $100,000 certificate, printed in the 1930s, gold and orange, bearing Woodrow Wilson, that was never legal for a private citizen to possess at all. It existed for the government to pay itself. These were real instruments of American money for the better part of a century. And then they vanished in 2 quiet steps that most histories skip entirely. In 1945, the printing stopped, and on July 14, 1969, with almost no debate and barely a headline's worth of public attention, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury announced that every denomination above $100 was finished. As the big bills flowed back into banks, they would be pulled and destroyed. No act of Congress, no great national argument. The largest instruments of American cash were simply discontinued, the way an airline discontinues a route. But here is where the story turns strange. The bills were never voided. Every one of them remains, to this day, full legal tender of the United States. You could, in principle, pay a parking ticket with a $10,000 bill, and the clerk would owe you change. The government did not cancel them. It simply waited for them to come home and die. Most did, and some, this is the part that keeps the story alive, never came home. Out of all the $10,000 bills ever issued, a few hundred remain outstanding somewhere in the world, in vaults, in collections, in safe deposit boxes, in places no one has recorded, each one now worth many multiples of its face value, each one a small, crisp mystery. The Federal Reserve knows exactly how many are missing, but does not know where a single one of them is. So the questions stack up like uncounted bills. Why did a nation of $5 paychecks print $10,000 notes in the first place? Who was actually using them, and for what? Why did the printing stop in 1945? Of all years, what happened in that specific moment? Why did the government wait a quarter century, and then kill them in 1969? And why did the announcement talk about crime? Whose face is on the 10,000? And how did a man who was never president end up on the biggest bill in general circulation? A story of ambition and self-promotion that is one of the best-kept jokes in American money. Where did $1 million and $10,000 bills sit on public display for decades, behind glass, and of all places a casino, and where did those 100 bills go when the glass came down? And underneath all of it, the question this documentary is really about, because the death of the big bills was not a housekeeping decision. It was a border marker. On one side of 1969 lies the old world of money, physical, anonymous, transportable, a world where value could move without leaving a record, for good and for ill. On the other side lies our world, the world of the wire, the report, the threshold, the flag transaction, a world built, piece by piece and law by law, in the very years the big bills were dying, on the principle that money above a certain size must be visible to the state. The $10,000 bill did not just go extinct. It was the last of its species, and the story of where it went is the story of how American money learned to watch and be watched. It begins in a world that is almost impossible for a tap-to-pay generation to imagine. A world where money, all of it, at every scale, had to physically go places. Strip away everything electronic from your mental picture of money, because none of it exists where this story starts. No wires in the modern sense, no databases, no balances updated by keystroke. In the American financial system of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when serious value moved, something physical moved. Gold coin in kegs, bullion under guard, or the innovation that made the system workable at all. Paper representing them in denominations built for the job. First, calibrate the scale, because the denominations only make sense against the wages of their world. In the years the small-sized big bills were designed, an American factory worker earned on the order of $25 a week. A school teacher perhaps $1,500 a year. A solid family house in most of the country cost a few $1,000s. A new Ford, several hundred. Against that world, the $500 bill was several months of a workman's labor in one piece of paper. The 1,000 was half a year. The 10,000 was a house with a car in the driveway, or 5 to 7 years of ordinary wages, foldable and payable to bearer. Almost no American ever saw one. For the same reason, almost no American today has seen a bearer bond. These were not consumer objects. Surveys and memoirs of the era agree that a person could work a lifetime in an ordinary town and never once witness a denomination above 100. The big bills lived in a parallel circulation, bank to bank, vault to vault, glimpsed by the public mainly in newspaper engravings and heist stories, which is precisely why, decades later, their existence strikes each new generation as a hoax that fact-checkers must keep confirming. It is real. Your great-grandparents' government printed a house. Understand who the big bills were for, because it was never the man on the street. The 500s, thousands, 5,000s, and 10,000s were the heavy machinery of finance. Banks settling with banks, clearinghouses balancing the day's accounts, corporations moving payrolls and purchases, wealthy individuals transacting in real estate and securities. A country bank remitting to its city correspondent, an insurance company funding a mortgage, a broker settling a securities delivery. In a paper world, these transactions meant currency. Physically counted, physically carried, physically stored, and every extra digit on a note's face meant fewer notes to count and thinner packets to guard. $1 million in tens is a trunk and a target. $1 million in 10,000s is an envelope. High denominations were not extravagance. They were compression. The zip files of the paper age. Picture the daily ritual the big bills served, because it was one of the unphotographed spectacles of American finance. Every banking day, in the settlement rooms of the great clearinghouses, the messengers of the city's banks converged to square the day's mutual claims, and the net differences were paid then and there, physically, in the highest instruments available. Stacks of gold certificates and large notes counted across marble counters, packed into satchels, walked through the financial district under guard in the era's most nonchalant fortunes in transit. A single day's settlements in New York could move sums that dwarfed state budgets, hand to hand, on foot, in paper. The big bills also rode the rails. Correspondent banking, the system this series mapped in the 1907 story, ran on physical currency shipments between country banks and their city reservoirs. Registered mail and express packages of high-denomination notes crossing the continent nightly. An entire circulatory system of paper that employed armies of counters, guards and clerks whose trades have vanished so completely that their job titles read like archaeology. This is the constituency the $10,000 bill was printed for. Not tycoons lighting cigars, couriers, cages, and counting rooms. The invisible logistics of a money that had mass. The habit ran deep in the architecture. From the Civil War onward, in the greenback and national banknote eras, this series has visited. The Treasury issued high denominations across nearly every family of American paper, legal tender notes, gold certificates, silver certificates, and eventually Federal Reserve notes in the large elegant format collectors called horse blankets, and then, after 1928, in the small modern size. Gold certificates in particular, the warehouse receipts for vault metal, workhorses of interbank settlement, ran routinely to $5,000 and $10,000 because their whole purpose was moving bank-scale value without moving the metal itself. And at the system's very summit sat the note that answers a trivia question almost no one gets right. The largest bill the United States ever printed was not the 10,000. In the mid-1930s, in the aftermath of the gold nationalization this series is chronicled, when the Treasury suddenly owned all the monetary gold and the Federal Reserve banks needed a way to hold claims on it, the Bureau of Engraving printed a run of $100,000 gold certificates. Wilson's portrait, orange back, some tens of thousands of pieces, used purely as an accounting token between the Treasury and the Reserve banks. It never touched a private hand. Possessing one was and remains illegal for a citizen. The survivors live in the Smithsonian and in official display cases, the coelacanths of American cash. The 100,000 is the purest specimen of what all the big bills fundamentally were. Not really money for people, money for the plumbing. The bill's final form was itself a child of the 1920s efficiency gospel. In 1928, the Treasury shrank American currency, the stately old horse blankets giving way to the smaller modern note, a redesign driven by the unromantic mathematics of paper costs and printing yields, and with the shrinkage came standardization. One portrait per denomination, fixed across all note families, assigned by Treasury Committee. The assignments above the 100 were, in effect, a little pantheon curated by bureaucrats. McKinley on the 500, Cleveland on the 1,000, Madison on the 5,000. Each choice trailing its own faint logic of gold standard martyrdom, hard money rectitude, or founding gravity, none of it ever officially explained in terms that satisfy the curious, which is why the question of who is on the big bills and why remains one of the happiest rabbit holes in American trivia. And at the top, the committee reached past every president to a Treasury secretary. But the 10,000, the top of the public range, carried a portrait, and the portrait carries one of the best stories in American currency, a story that ties this episode to half the others in this series. The face on the $10,000 bill belongs to Salmon P. Chase. If the name rings distantly, it should. Chase has walked through these documentaries before. He was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, the man who financed the Civil War, the man on whose watch the greenbacks were born, the national banking system was built, and the words "In God We Trust" first went on to American coinage. A founding architect, in other words, of the very money system this whole series inhabits. He was also, his contemporaries said it with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, one of the most nakedly ambitious men in American public life. A serial presidential aspirant who pursued the office from inside Lincoln's own cabinet, whose intrigues Lincoln tolerated with the weary observation, preserved in substance by the tellers. That Chase's presidential fever was a gnawing thing no favor could cure, and Chase left posterity a monument to that ambition hiding in plain sight. When the first greenbacks were designed in 1862, under his authority, the face chosen for the $1 bill, the note most Americans would handle most often, in the first election-adjacent years of national paper money, was not Washington's and not Lincoln's. It was Chase's own. The secretary put himself on the people's dollar, with the campaign value of the placement escaping precisely no one. The presidency never came. Lincoln ultimately parked him, brilliantly, as Chief Justice, where his ambitions could gnaw in robes, and the final joke belonged to the engravers of a later generation. When the small-size high denominations were designed in the 20th century, Chase received at last the biggest portrait in American circulation on the bill almost no American would ever see. The most ambitious self-promoter in the history of the Treasury ended as the face of the money the public never touched, honored at $10,000 and invisible. Somewhere, Lincoln is smiling. But the Chase story has one more chamber, and it contains the finest irony in the history of American money, so fine that if a novelist invented it, the editor would strike it as too neat. Chase's road to the Treasury ran through decades as one of the country's foremost anti-slavery lawyers. He defended so many escaped slaves and their allies in Ohio courtrooms that admirers called him, in substance, the Attorney General of fugitives. Then through the Senate and the Ohio governorship to Lincoln's cabinet, where necessity made this hard money man the reluctant father of the greenback. Paper money, unbacked by gold, issued on the government's bare word, which Chase authorized in the war's desperation while privately doubting. He said so at the time, that the Constitution permitted any such thing. Now run the clock forward. Lincoln elevates Chase to Chief Justice of the United States. And in 1870, in a case called Hepburn against Griswold, the Supreme Court is asked squarely, were the greenbacks constitutional as applied to prior debts? Chief Justice Chase, writing for the majority, answers no, striking down from the bench the money he himself had issued from the Treasury, the father of the greenback ruling his own child illegitimate. The decision was reversed the following year by a reconstituted court. The greenbacks survived, as this series is told, but the spectacle stands alone in American history. The same man, at the two summits of government, on both sides of the same dollar. When you look at the $10,000 bill, you are looking at the only face in the American wallet that both created its money and condemned it, ambition, necessity, and conscience, engraved at the denomination of invisibility. So there is the old world, assembled, a financial system whose bloodstream was paper, whose largest corpuscles bore the faces of presidents and one magnificent, almost president, and whose big bills did quiet, legitimate, structural work that ordinary citizens never witnessed. For decades, the arrangement was so unremarkable that no one thought to question it. Then, across one long generation, from 1913 to 1945, 3 revolutions converged on the big bills, and by the end of the third, the species was doomed. The first revolution was a wire. The second was a war on gold. The third was simply a war. The first revolution announced itself in clicks. In 1918, the young Federal Reserve System. Born, as this series is told, from the panic of 1907, strung together something that history has under-celebrated to an almost criminal degree. A dedicated telegraph network linking the reserve banks and the Treasury, over which funds could be transferred between banks' accounts by coded message. Settlement without shipment. Value moving as information. It was the ancestor of the system bankers still call the wire, Fedwire, in its modern form, and moves trillions of dollars a day, and its meaning for our story is direct. The moment banks could settle by telegraph, the core job of the high denomination note, compressing bank-scale value into portable paper, began, slowly, to evaporate. Not all at once. The wire's reach grew over decades, and paper habits died generationally. But from 1918 forward, every year made the big bills a little more ceremonial, a little less structural. The plumbing was going electric, and the $10,000 note was becoming what technology always becomes when its function migrates. A container without contents, waiting for someone to notice. The wire's founding machinery deserves one more sentence of respect, because its elegance explains its victory. In 1915, the reserve banks established a gold settlement fund in Washington. Each bank's gold credited on a central ledger, and from then on, settling between districts required moving nothing but entries. The telegraph of 1918 merely gave the ledger speed. It was the clearinghouse principle: net the claims, move only the difference, promoted to continental scale and dematerialized. The exact function the $10,000 gold certificate performed in a messenger's satchel, performed henceforth by a clerk's keystroke against a Washington ledger. Every modern payment rail on Earth, the wires, the card networks, the instant systems, is that 1915 ledger with better wires. The big bills were not defeated by any enemy. They were defeated by bookkeeping. The second revolution struck in 1933, and this series has told its story in full, the gold recall. Executive Order 6102 and its sequels, which called in not only the coins but the gold certificates, including the mighty $5,000 and $10,000 certificates that had been the settlement system's paper backbone. Watch what that operation rehearsed, because it is the exact template of 1969, run first at national scale. A class of currency declared finished, the public required or induced to bring it home. The notes retired as they arrived, the stragglers living on in mattresses and collections as contraband turned collectible. The gold recall proved that the American government could, without canceling a single obligation, cause an entire species of money to die simply by refusing to let it recirculate, extinction by one-way valve. File the mechanism. It returns in the finale, and the gold recall handed law enforcement, as an accidental byproduct, one of the most famous forensic breaks in criminal history, a preview of everything the 1969 world would become. In 1932, the ransom paid in the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's infant son, the crime of the century, whose place in this series' driving story you may recall, had been assembled, at investigators' deliberate insistence, largely in gold certificates, with every serial number recorded. Then came 1933, and the recall. Gold certificates were called home, and the ones that stayed out, the ransom among them, became, with each passing year, stranger and stranger objects to hand across a counter. In September 1934, a gas station attendant in the Bronx, made suspicious by exactly such a note, penciled the customer's license plate on its margin. The certificate surfaced at a bank. Days later, the plate led to a Bronx carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann, and in his garage investigators found thousands more in ransom certificates. Whatever one's view of the trial that followed, and it has its literature of doubt, the mechanism is the point for our story. A currency recall had turned anonymous cash into a tracking device. The money itself testified. The lesson was not lost on a single treasury or police force on Earth. Marked value catches men. The entire reporting regime this story is marching toward is that gas station margin note industrialized. The Third Revolution wore a uniform. The Second World War put the fear of cash, specifically of big, anonymous, hostile cash, into the American government in ways both concrete and instructive. In Hawaii in 1942, with invasion a live planning scenario, the authorities executed one of the strangest currency operations in American history. Ordinary money was recalled from the islands and replaced with special notes overprinted Hawaii, so that if the islands fell, every dollar there could be declared void from Washington, and the recalled currency, some $200 million of it, was burned in crematoria and sugar mill furnaces, the ash oven economy taken as a war precaution. In Europe, as the war ended, occupation authorities wrestled with looted wealth, flight capital, and black markets swimming in high-value paper, the nightmare version of the anonymous note, cash as the getaway vehicle of a continent's plunder. The Hawaii operation had a Mediterranean twin. For the invasion of North Africa in 1942, troops carried special yellow seal dollars, ordinary notes distinguished by a gold-colored Treasury seal, so that if stocks fell to the enemy, that entire issue could be repudiated at a stroke. The same logic, the voidable dollar, applied at expeditionary scale. And as the Reich collapsed, the moral of anonymous value was being written across Europe in its ugliest hand. Plundered gold and currencies laundered through neutral banks, fortunes moving in suitcases ahead of the armies, occupation currencies spawning black markets in which cigarettes outperformed paper. A continent demonstrating, in real time, everything untraceable money makes possible when civilization's referees leave the field. The American officials who would spend the post-war decades building the visible money world had, many of them, taken their instruction in these years, at first hand. Against that backdrop, in 1945, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing simply stopped printing all denominations above $100. No proclamation, a production decision, of the kind that appears in annual reports rather than headlines. The existing stock would circulate. The Fed went on paying out big bills from inventory for years, but the species had stopped reproducing. 1945 is the extinction's true beginning, the year the plumbing no longer needed the paper, and the war had taught the plumbers what the paper could do in the wrong hands. For the next quarter century, the big bills lived the strange afterlife of the obsolete, legal, available, and increasingly pointless, for honest purposes. Banks kept modest stocks for the occasional customer. The notes turned up in real estate closings, in estate hoards, in the pockets of the theatrically rich. But their legitimate constituency, the interbank settlement world, had gone electric, and a note with no legitimate constituency does not simply fade. It selects a new one. Cash's virtues are permanent. It is anonymous, untraceable, and final. As lawful finance migrated to the wire, precisely those virtues concentrated the big bill's remaining appeal among users for whom anonymity was not a convenience but the entire point. The tax evader, the smuggler, the courier of organized crime, for whom the $1,000 bill in particular became, by the accounts of the era's investigators, a working tool. Compact enough to move fortunes in briefcases, liquid enough to spend, respectable enough to bank. By the 1960s, the government's own analysts had reached the conclusion the announcement would soon make official. The large denominations' honest work was gone, and their remaining circulation served, disproportionately, the shadows. The shadow constituency did not go unnoticed while it grew. The post-war decades documented it in hearings and headlines. The Kefauver Committee's televised organized crime investigations of the early 1950s, the first great television event of American politics, watched by tens of millions, walked the public through the cash anatomy of the rackets, the skim, the courier, the safe deposit box, the wealth that appeared on no return. and the era's tax prosecutions. The government's chosen weapon against untouchable men since Capone turned repeatedly on exactly the question the big bills existed to obscure. Where did the currency come from? Ransom notes in the era's kidnapping cases specified denominations with a connoisseur's care. Large bills compact enough to carry, small enough to spend, and the newspaper's underworld coverage made the $1,000 bill a stock character. The gangster's chip flashed at tracks and tables, stuffed in the era's discovered caches. None of this constituted a statistical census. The whole point of anonymous money is that it cannot be counted by user, and honest tellings, this one included, must flag that the shadow share of the big bill circulation was then, and remains, an official inference rather than a measured fact. But the inference was drawn by the people with the best available view, the Treasury, the Bureau of Narcotics, the taxmen, and by the 60s it had hardened into the administrative consensus that made 1969 possible. Whatever legitimate life the big bills had once lived was over, and the government that continued printing anonymity at $10,000 a sheet was, in its own agent's judgment, supplying its adversaries. And so we arrive at July 14, 1969, and at one of the most consequential, unfamous days in the history of American money. The announcement, when it came, was almost defiantly boring. The Federal Reserve, with the Treasury's concurrence, stated that due to lack of use, denominations of $500, $1,000, $5,000, and $10,000 would be discontinued. Notes reaching the banks would be removed and destroyed. The $100 bill would henceforth stand as the ceiling of American cash. The context, though, was anything but boring, and the newspapers of that week caught it plainly. The new Nixon administration had declared war on organized crime, and the retirement of the gangster's favorite paper was reported accurately as a weapon in it, an attack on the mob's money supply, dressed in a green eyeshade. The one-way valve of 1933 was opened again, this time forever. No recall squads, no deadlines, no drama, just every big bill's next visit to a bank becoming its last. The species was not executed. It was allowed to die of circulation. The dying itself had a texture worth recording, because it played out in 10,000 small scenes over decades. After 1969, every big bill lived under a simple sentence. Its next deposit was its death. Banks receiving one were required to ship it onward for destruction rather than pay it out again. So the note's return migrated to the occasions when cash must finally be counted, estates settled, safe deposit boxes opened by heirs, hoards surrendered by the elderly, the occasional briefcase surfacing in a seizure. Bank tellers of the 70s and 80s told the era's newspapers of the odd ceremonial moments. A customer presenting a $1,000 bill kept since the war, photographed with it before handing it over. The note's serial dutifully recorded on its way to the furnace. Year by year, the outstanding figures ticked down, and then somewhere in the 80s and 90s, the strangest thing in the whole story happened. The numbers nearly stopped moving. The remaining notes had crossed the collectible threshold, worth more alive than dead, and redemption effectively ceased. The Federal Reserve's outstanding counts for the top denominations have barely budged in decades, frozen registers of a population that will now die of accident and fire rather than banking. The government's furnace, having consumed millions, waits for a last few hundred guests who are never coming, and die it did, but not completely. Which brings us to the question in this documentary's title, and to the numbers that keep it deliciously open. The Federal Reserve, which accounts for every note it has ever issued, can state the survivorship with eerie precision. Of the $10,000 bills, roughly 336 remain outstanding. Not in government hands, not destroyed, simply out there. Of the 5,000s, on the order of 340. Of the thousands and 500s, tens upon tens of thousands each, enough that they still surface routinely. Everyone remains legal tender, and almost none of them will ever be spent. Because the market solved the big bill's fate with a twist the Treasury never planned. Extinction made them treasure. A $10,000 bill in fine condition trades among collectors today for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Individual specimens have crossed the $500,000 line at auction. Even the humble 500 commands multiples of face. The bills the government sentenced to death by banking are now far too valuable ever to be banked. The one-way valve worked perfectly, and then, at the very end, the last survivors slipped out of the economy entirely. Not into the shadows this time, but into the vault of collectibles, where money goes when it stops being money and becomes history you can hold. The collectible ascension has its own aristocracy and its own record book, worth a moment because the numbers measure exactly how completely the transformation ran. At the summit of the entire hobby sits a note from the big bill's large-size ancestry. An 1890 $1,000 Treasury note known to collectors, for the fat green zeros on its back, as the Grand Watermelon, a nickname of perfect American irreverence for an object that changed hands at auction for well over $3 million. A $1,000 bill worth 3,000 times its face, the most expensive piece of United States paper money ever sold. Below it, the small-sized 10,000s trade in the hundreds of thousands, the 5,000s likewise, and even star-crossed specimens, notes with replacement markings, rare districts, low serials, carry premiums that turn cataloging into treasure hunting. There is a final regulatory grace note that collectors savor. The $100,000 Wilson certificate remains illegal to own privately, the one American note that is contraband by nature, so the ceiling of the collection can never be collected. The hobby's white whale is permanently welded to the museum wall. The market, in short, has done to the big bills what this series has watched happen to gold coins and ghost double eagles. Value, expelled from the monetary system, does not always die. Sometimes it is reborn as relic, at prices the monetary system itself could never have paid. No chapter of that afterlife is more American than the one that sat for decades behind glass in downtown Las Vegas. Benny Binion, a Texas gambling boss with a criminal record he never much disguised, who had reinvented himself as the proprietor of the Horseshoe Casino, understood promotion the way Chase had understood portraiture. His masterstroke, the horseshoe displayed, in a giant horseshoe-shaped case by the entrance, $110,000 bills, $1 million in cash, the world's most photographed money wall, before which generations of tourists posed for free souvenir pictures, standing as close to a fortune as glass allows. For half a century, the display was a Las Vegas landmark. 100 specimens of the world's rarest circulating note, nearly a third of the entire surviving population, moonlighting as a photo prop. When the casino's fortunes turned around the millennium, the display came down and the bills passed, fittingly, through the channels of the collectible trade into private collections, scattering the greatest single hoard of 10,000s ever assembled. Binion himself merits the paragraph history usually grants only his display. He arrived in Las Vegas from Dallas in the 1940s ahead of trouble. His Texas years included bootlegging, gambling rackets, and convictions his biographers do not soften, and built at the Horseshoe a temple of a specific gambling creed. No limits, or as near as the house could bear. The joint, where a legend was made in the early 1980s when a gambler arrived with a fortune in cash, betted on a single craps decision, won, and returned years later to lose it the same way. A story Las Vegas has embroidered but whose documented core made the Horseshoe's name. Binion understood, decades before the marketing departments, that in a city selling fantasies of money, the most magnetic exhibit was money itself. Real, verified, and just out of reach. His $1 million horseshoe was thus not decoration. It was the casino's thesis behind glass, and its dispersal when the family's empire unraveled around the millennium closed more than a display. It closed the last public place on earth where an ordinary person could stand a pane of glass away from the biggest bill their country ever issued. If you have an old family photo of grandparents grinning in front of a wall of money in Vegas, that was it. They were standing in front of this entire documentary, now widen the lens, because the death of the big bills was the visible tip of a transformation that deserves to be seen whole, and 1969 turns out to be one bookend of a 2-year pivot that quietly rewrote the relationship between American money and the American state. The other bookend arrived the following year. In 1970, Congress passed the Bank Secrecy Act, a name of magnificent irony, since its entire purpose was the opposite of secrecy. It required banks for the first time to keep records and file reports on their customers' large cash movements, anchored by a number that has become one of the most consequential thresholds in American life, $10,000. Any cash transaction above it, reported to the government on a form by the bank as a matter of routine. Set the two events side by side and the design of the new world snaps into focus. In 1969, the government retired the instrument that let $10,000 travel as a single anonymous piece of paper. In 1970, it decreed that $10,000 traveling as cash in any form would generate a federal record. The same number attacked from both sides in successive years, the big bill killed and the big transaction tagged. Call it coincidence of round numbers if you like. The deeper point stands either way. Within 24 months, American money crossed from a default of anonymity to a default of visibility, and the crossing was permanent. What grew from the 1970 seed is the entire modern architecture of financial surveillance, and its story runs on rails this series has ridden before. The emergency ratchet, the institution outliving its justification, the threshold that quietly tightens by standing still. The reporting regime spawned its own vocabulary of offenses. Structuring, the crime of arranging your own deposits to stay under the threshold, an offense consisting entirely of the pattern of otherwise legal acts. Its case law filled with genuinely bad actors and, periodically, with small merchants whose seized accounts made national news and forced periodic reform. The threshold itself, $10,000, fixed in 1970, was never indexed to inflation. A sum that then bought a house now buys a used car, which means the reporting net, without a single vote to widen it, catches each year a larger share of ordinary economic life. The 1970 Congress built a fence, and inflation has been silently moving the fence inward for half a century. And the term that names the whole field, money laundering, tells its own story of this era. Popularized in the Watergate 70s, retrofitted with an origin myth about Capone and laundromats that historians of language treat as legend, and elevated by later statutes into a distinct federal crime whose global enforcement web, the Suspicious Activity Report, the Know Your Customer File, the International Task Force, now constitutes by any honest description the most comprehensive financial monitoring system ever constructed. Every strand of it descends, by direct statutory genealogy, from the 2-year pivot that began the week the big bills died. And the argument did not stop at 10,000, because the logic of 1969, once accepted, has no natural floor, and the past decade has watched it march openly on the 100. The $100 bill, the survivor, the new ceiling, has had since 1969 a strange double career, its real value shrinking year by year. Today's 100 buys what a mid-teen sum bought then, meaning America's largest note is, in real terms, among the smallest large notes in its history, while its physical population has exploded. There are today more hundreds in circulation than $1 bills. Well over a dozen billion pieces, the majority of them, by the Federal Reserve's own studies, held abroad. The underground and overseas world's favorite store of value, the $1,000 bill's roll reincarnated one denomination down, which has produced in our own time a direct rerun of the 1969 debate at academic and official volume. The economist Kenneth Rogoff's much-argued case for phasing out big bills entirely. The Curse of Cash, he titled it, on the classic grounds. Legitimate use has migrated to electronics. What remains disproportionately serves evasion and crime. Europe acted on the argument, the 500 euro note, the Bin Laden, the trade nicknamed it, on the logic that everyone knew it existed and no one had seen one, was discontinued from issuance in the late 2010s for precisely the 1969 reasons, word for word. The world has even run the experiment at maximum scale within the past decade, and the results belong in this ledger. In November 2016, the government of India announced, with a few hours' notice, that its 2 largest banknotes, together the vast majority of all cash in circulation by value, were void for transactions, redeemable only through banks within a deadline, demonetization, aimed by its architects at black money, counterfeiting, and the untaxed economy. What followed was the largest stress test of the cash abolition thesis ever conducted, months of queues and cash famine in an economy where hundreds of millions lived cash only. Disruption, whose costs economists have documented across small business and informal labor, and a final accounting in which nearly all the voided currency, the black hoard supposedly trapped, came back through the banks anyway, laundered, structured, or simply legitimate all along. Advocates point to the leap in digital payments that followed. Critics point to the meager haul of hidden wealth against the visible pain. The episode settled little and clarified much. Cash's role in a society is load-bearing in ways its abolitionists consistently underweight. And the 1969 American method, the slow one-way valve across decades, looks, beside the overnight guillotine, like a study in institutional patience. The counter-argument has also found its voice, and it deserves its full weight in this telling. Cash, its defenders answer, is the last instrument of financial privacy available to ordinary people, the only way to transact without generating a record. It is the payment system of the poor, the unbanked, the elderly. It is the fail-safe when grids and banks go down. And a society that eliminates anonymous money has not merely inconvenienced its criminals, it has abolished, for everyone, the possibility of an unobserved economic act. Both cases are serious. Both are made by serious people. And the debate is not history. It is the live frontier, sharpened now by the prospect of central bank digital currencies. Money as pure database entry, programmable, traceable, the logical terminus of the road 1969 opened. The $10,000 bill, seen from here, was not just a casualty of progress. It was the first fence post of a boundary. The boundary between money the state can see and money it cannot, that has been moving in one direction without pause for over half a century. So where did they all go? The title's question, it turns out, has 3 true answers, nested inside each other like envelopes. The literal answer, into the furnaces. The overwhelming majority of every high denomination ever printed flowed back through the banking system. In the ordinary course, in the gold recall, in the long one-way ebb after 1969, was verified, cancelled, and destroyed by the government that issued it. The fate of nearly all paper money everywhere. A few hundred 10,000s, a few hundred 5,000s, and scattered tens of thousands of their smaller siblings escaped the valve. Into collections, mostly documented, occasionally surfacing at auction to headlines, conceivably here and there into a forgotten box awaiting the best day of some heir's life. That is where the paper went, the functional answer. Into the wire. The work the big bills did, moving serious value between serious institutions, did not vanish. It migrated into the electronic settlement system, whose 1918 telegraph ancestor we met, where it grew beyond any paper era's dreams. The daily flow through the modern wire exceeds, every few days, the value of all physical U.S. currency in existence. The $10,000 bill was not replaced by the 100. It was replaced by the message, money's final dematerialization, from metal to paper to signal. That is where the function went, and the deepest answer, into the visible world. What truly disappeared in 1969 was not a piece of cotton paper, but a capability, the capability of ordinary large value to move namelessly. And that capability went where this series has watched so many things go. Into the state's field of vision, traded away in the name of crime and taxes, emergency by emergency, statute by statute, without any single moment when the nation looked at the whole bargain and voted on it. Reasonable people, this documentary has tried to honor both kinds, disagree about whether the bargain was wise. The case that anonymous big money served chiefly the predator is strong and documented. The case that a society should retain some final unwatched instrument of exchange is also strong, and grows more pointed as the watch share approaches everything. What is not debatable is that the bargain happened and that almost no one noticed, which makes the $10,000 bill the perfect artifact of this entire series, a concrete, photographable, faintly absurd object whose disappearance encodes an enormous invisible transfer of power, hidden history you could once have folded into a wallet. Could the big bills ever return? The question surfaces perennially. Proposals to reissue large notes for inflation's sake, or conversely to abolish the hundred and finish 1969's work, and the answer illuminates how completely the world is chosen. No treasury in the developed world has reintroduced a retired high denomination in the modern era, and the direction of travel, from Brussels to Washington to Delhi, runs one way. The reasons are the ones this story has assembled. The legitimate constituency never returned. The wire holds it. The illegitimate constituency is precisely the one policy exists to inconvenience. And the surveillance architecture built since 1970 has made the anonymous instrument not merely unwanted by the state, but structurally alien to it. The $10,000 bill is not sleeping. It is extinct in the exact biological sense. Its habitat is gone. They are still out there, the last few hundred legal tender to the final specimen, too precious ever to be spent, each one worth a fortune precisely because the world that needed it is gone. Somewhere tonight, in a dealer's safe or a bank box or a drawer that hasn't been opened since Nixon, Salmon Chase's patient, ambitious face is waiting in the dark, the man who put himself on the people's dollar, exiled at last onto money too rare for people. The highest bill America ever handed its citizens, outliving its economy, its purpose, and its century, as the most valuable piece of paper the Treasury ever tried to throw away. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten systems, people, and decisions that shape the modern world, subscribe for more documentaries like this. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.